So, you want to set yourself on fire using Blender. Here's how to do it. Firstly, I used F-Spy, which is a camera alignment tool. Bring in a single frame from your footage and then just use the X and Y handles to align the X and Y axes in your footage. Set the origin point to be in the center, and then go to File, Save As, and save this somewhere in your project folder. Then jump into Blender, go File, Import, make sure you have the F-Spy add-on enabled, and then bring in your F-Spy camera. Add a plane for the floor and then scale it to be whatever size the floor is in your scene and move it into position. Then with your camera selected, go to background image and import the full image sequence for your background footage. Pro tip, exporting your background image at something like 480p makes it play back a lot better in Blender. This is the 480p version playing back very smoothly, and if I change it to the full HD version you can see it stutters when it's playing back. Next step, bring in a 3D model of a person. I've made one that's fully rigged so that I can use it in all of my videos because I find myself doing this fairly often now. It's a good idea to make it as tall as the actual person in the shot. And now you know because the object is the correct size and the camera's in the correct place, you can just move it backwards and forwards in 3D space, and once it lines up with your background footage, you know that's the correct location. Now go to the keying menu and change active keying set to location and rotation. This means whenever you press I, all of the bones selected will have a keyframe for location and rotation added to them. When I was doing this, I found that splitting up the viewport and having a camera view, front-on view and a side-on view was really useful for moving the body parts instead of having to constantly rotate around the object. To see the background footage a bit better, because currently the model is kind of obscuring it, go under the background image tab with your camera selected and change depth from back to front and then turn up the alpha. Now you can see the background footage a lot more, but you can also still see where the model is, which is really helpful. Now go through and move all of the limbs into place. It's worth taking the time to do this properly because the first time I did it, I was a bit lazy, so I had to go back and fix it later on. Once the first pose is done, select all of the bones with A and hit I to add a keyframe. Then it's just rinse and repeat. Go through to all of the key poses in the running or whatever your person is doing in the footage, add a new pose and then create a new keyframe for that pose. Unless you've actually made a custom 3D model that matches your body exactly, the chances are the model's not going to have the same proportions as you. For the one that I did, I found the legs of the model were actually a little bit longer than my legs in real life, which meant that they weren't really lining up with the background footage properly. The way I fixed this is I keyframed them to scale a little bit up and down just to make them longer or shorter on certain frames. This would look a little bit weird if you were watching it in 3D space, but this only really needs to line up from the camera's perspective, so you can just scale the bones a little bit to cheat that. Once you've taken the time to do that whole process properly, it should look something like this, where the model lines up really nicely with the background footage. Now it's time to set this bad boy on fire, so add a quick smoke effect onto the mesh of the person. Scale the domain up so the entire animation fits inside of it, and also leave some space to account for the fact that some smoke and fire might rise up. On the mesh of the person, in the object panel, change viewport display back to textured because we want to actually be able to see it. Next, add a cube, scale it up to be a little bit bigger than the person, and then subdivide it about 4 times and apply the modifier. Now add a displace modifier onto the cube, add a new texture and call it whatever you want, and then go into the texture settings, change the type to clouds, and then go back into the modifier settings and turn down the strength so it's not quite so mental. Change the texture coordinates from local to global, which means when you move the object, the displacement will change. I also added another subdivision surface modifier just to smooth it out a bit. Next, place it below the person model and add a keyframe for location and scale. With it still selected, shift select the rig, control tab into pose mode, and then select the root bone, press Ctrl P and parent to bone. And now what you should see if you play through the animation is the displaced cube is stuck to the rig. Now go to the point where you want the fire to have completely consumed the mesh, move it up and then scale it up to completely cover the mesh. Now press I and add another keyframe for location and scale. The next step is to add a new vertex group onto the mesh. This is going to be what we use to emit the fire. With the person mesh still selected, add a dynamic paint modifier and then open it up and add a canvas. Then select the distorted cube, also add a dynamic paint modifier to this, but set it to add brush instead. Then click back on the person mesh, go to surface type and change it from paint to weight, and then scroll down, open the output menu and change the vertex group to the one that we created for emitting the fire. Then if you hit bake, that will create a cache file on your hard drive and save all of that weight information. Then I changed the display type for the cube to wireframe and then went into weight painting mode to double check that it was working. And if I scroll through the animation, you can see that it's blue, and then once the cube passes over it, it turns red. Basically, blue will be not emitting fire and red will be emitting fire. So now open up the fluid settings and make that vertex group we created the fire emission. For the domain settings, I set my resolution to 300, and then I tried to make the CFL number and maximum time steps a bit higher as well to reduce the stepping, but as you'll see later, it didn't really work. I enabled adaptive domain to make it bake a little bit faster, I turned the vorticity up to 0.6 to make it a little bit more aggressive, and then I also turned on dissolve and slow and set the time to 18 to make it dissolve quite slowly. I did use some noise to add some detail, but I turned the strength really low because I found that it goes mental very easily. Change the type to either modular or final depending on what you're doing, change the data and noise file format to OpenVDB, and then set the frames for which part of your sequence you're using and then hit bake. And then after a fairly short or large amount of time, depending on how good your computer is, you should see something like this. So time to render. I've got 4 different render layers. One is for the render of the actual Human Torch model, which is just this on its own. I've disabled everything else in the scene, like the floor and the fire simulation. Then I have a render layer called Reflections, which I'm going to use in Compositing to add some lighting interaction onto the floor from all of the fire. The fire should be visible in this render layer, but I had to delete the bake to show the render settings and I couldn't be bothered to rebake it, but I'll show this pass properly in Compositing. The floor material is set to a diffuse black that I kind of eyeballed the roughness to match the concrete that I was standing on in the shot. The idea with it being black is that any areas that are completely unlit by the light, when I plus it on top of the footage in Nuke, will become invisible. The shader on the fire is called the Wisp shader. It's something that I downloaded from BlendSwap about 3 years ago before Blender had a principled volume shader. Unfortunately, it's not free. It costs $15, so it's really good for the money, but obviously not everyone's going to want to pay for that. I'd really recommend watching Iridicium's recent flamethrower video if you want a video on how to make a good fire shader. Anyway, once you've got the look for the fire, I did one render layer where I turned off the fire in the shader and one where I turned off the smoke. Then the last step that's kind of optional but I think looks really cool is making the kind of transitional line to wipe between the effect and the live action footage. To do this, go into the modifiers tab and add a mask modifier, and then set the vertex group to be the flame emission that we use to create the fire. This is going to cut out the parts of the model that aren't included in the vertex group, and then it slowly moves up with that displaced cube. Then press Shift D with the displaced cube selected and scale it down slightly so it sits just inside. Then add a boolean modifier and set the object to be the second cube that we've just created. And what this will do is cut out anything below the cube, so we're going to have just the middle section left. You can change the scale of this to suit your liking and then go through and add a few scale keyframes over the course of the animation so that that line stays consistent. Okay, into 2D land, let's do some compositing. The first thing I did obviously is drop in the render of the Human Torch model so that I could see the lineup of the body. I desaturated it a little bit because fire is never quite as orange as it comes out of Blender when you look at it in real world footage. It's got a pretty subtle glow on it as well just to give it a bit of extra life, and then it's also defocused slightly to match the camera sharpness. Then I drew a mask that matched the timing of the transitional line, and then I used that to remove my body from the shot. Instead of using a freeze frame, I just slipped the timing of the shot to use a section where I wasn't in the frame, and that meant I could preserve the original grain of the footage. Next I added the render of the transition line, and you can see it sitting just above where the mask starts to fade my body off. Then I used the same mask to reveal the render of the body so that it would also move with the transition line. Next up I put the fire and the smoke on top as well. Again with the fire I desaturated it quite a bit to take some of that really punchy orange out. The fire has a couple of layers of glow on it. There's a really small one and then there's also a much bigger one that's mixed in much more subtly. And then underneath all of that goes the reflection layer for the lighting interaction with the floor. There was a bit of a quirk in Blender where the smoke domain was actually cutting out part of the reflection, so what I ended up doing was rendering the reflection with all of the fire and everything in it, and then I used a difference operation between that and the fire layer, which gave me just the reflections on its own. And then it's just really small details to make the shot a bit better, so I added an exposure shift in the background once the fire gets really big, because it would be casting a lot of light at this point. I also added a really soft glow, which is almost like a bloom effect, which I just did by blurring the fire render loads and then plussing it back on top really subtly. And then on top of everything I just added a layer of heat haze, which makes the fire feel really big and powerful. I just took the render of the fire and then did a directional blur to kind of smear it upwards and left quite a lot so it went further than the fire render. And then I used that as a mask for the heat haze to define where the heat haze is actually happening. And that's it. I'm just going to talk about one thing really quickly that some people mentioned in the comments of the last video. They pointed out that the simulation looked a little bit boxy, which I totally agree with, and they suggested rebaking it at a higher resolution. So I rebaked all of the fire with a resolution of 1000. I do think it looks a little bit better, but it still has the same kind of problems, even though the resolution is about 4 times as much. I think this might just be a problem with MantaFlow, where it's just not quite as good as something like Houdini at the moment. You can also very distinctively see the body repeating lots in the simulation. That's to do with the time steps that I mentioned earlier, where I tried to change it and it didn't really work. I changed the CFL number as well as the maximum and minimum time steps, as well as the sampling substeps on the actual fire emission mesh. And it doesn't actually seem to have done anything, even though I really cranked the settings. So if anyone that's still watching this knows how to fix that, I'd be really interested to hear, so please leave it in the comments below and let me know. In all of my tests, I found the less the emitting object is moving, the better the fire tends to look. So for this example in the thumbnail, the fire wasn't actually moving much and it looks a lot more high resolution. Whereas in my animation, because the emitter is moving very quickly, I think that is what makes it look quite blocky sometimes. I think some motion blur would have helped a lot and made it a lot more forgiving, but unfortunately MantaFlow can't render smoke and fire with motion blur at the moment, which is a massive drawback. So I'm probably going to leave some smoke and fire stuff until they sort that out. But yeah, that is how to do the Human Torch effect. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching this video, hope it was useful and you've learned some stuff. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you very soon.